I'd like to welcome you to the Deer Predation Lab, and we're going to be looking at the effects of wolves on deer population, and we're not going to worry too much about other factors like food for the deer and other things. And later on, we're going to extrapolate the effects of wolves on deer population to that on buffalo, and this will require some math and some graphing skills. So please make sure you look at the videos that go along with this lecture, and also pay attention to how I show you how to go through the activity. So the goal of this lab is we're going to calculate the number of deaths, and what we're going to have to do is look at the number of deaths due to predation, okay, plus starvation. And deer can be die from other things too when we start sampling deer in a population. So we're going to do deer sampling virtually, since we can't do it in actuality. And so we're going to look at deer population over time. That means as a deer reproduce, we're going to look at the number of deer that are born and the deaths, of course, due to these two factors. And then from this, we're going to look at the overall change in deer population over time compared to the wolf population, because as wolves are preying on deer, the populations are going to interact. That means the deer population will change over time, and that will affect the wolf population. And we're going to see what that looks like on the graph ultimately. So to get full credit for this project, or I should say this virtual lab in a way, is you are going to have to answer some questions and input information in a data table, and I'll show you how to do that. Plus, you're going to come up with two graphs that, if you wish, you can put them together in what's called an overlay. So I'm going to provide you with two pieces of graph paper that you're going to graph the deer population on one and the wolf population on the other, and compare what the curves look like over specified periods of time as predation is going on. So guys, this is going to be pretty tricky when we look at calculating deer population. The important thing you have to consider is you need to know an important piece of data to know that at the beginning of each year, that means right here, the beginning of each year that we're going to look at in the sampling, is you have to calculate the total number of deer entering a certain year. So what we're going to look at is the results of 1970, and we're not going to worry about starting population, blah, 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 blah. We're just going to know in 1970, the end of that year, the deer in the last day of December, entering into January of 1971, was 2,000 deer. And don't worry about how much area that was, how many wolves were involved, how many died. Just know that that's your starting number. So that 2,000 is going to be part of your starting number for the year 1971. So let us now work out 1971. Just right now, keep in mind there are 10 wolves. Just keep track of that information. You'll need to know that later when you're graphing the wolves. So in 1971, let's make believe every month we went out and sampled for deer. And we discovered that over the year 1971, of the 2,000 deer that started out, 800 were born in that population, which is about right for how deer breed. So there's 800 right there. Now we're going to count deaths, and we're not going to count all the types of deaths that could occur. We're going to look at deaths due to predation, which is doable because you can see the carcasses kind of being torn apart, laid down, crows at that point picking from the stuff that the wolves didn't eat. We could also look at starvation, and that means we find deer that just starve or they die of disease. Don't worry about that. So we can see that in 1971, of the 2,800 deer that made up that year, because remember, there are 800 babies, 2,000 adults, okay, because deer give birth seasonally, so all the babies come out at one time. So we're going to see in 1971, 400 deer died from predation, 100 from starvation. So that means the total number of deaths in that year, out of 2,800 deer, 500 died. So what was the total change in the population of deer? Okay, so total population So we now have our starting number of 2,000. I mean, that's our starting population. Just here's how we do the math. Is when you get to this point, you just say 500 died. How'd you get that? 400 from predation, 100 from starvation. That's 500. The population change is 300. What do we mean by that? There were 800 deer born. We call that, birth, birth, okay, or natality. 500 of the deer. It could have been the young ones. It could have been adults. We don't know at this point, but 500 died. So in that year of 800 births, 500 deer died, which gives a net change of plus 300, because more were born than died. And that's not always true, but in this situation that occurred. So we started out with 2,000 adults from the previous year. We add the 300 and you get 2,300. So where does that number go? It goes to 1972. So we start another year. The total number of deer entering to 1972 is from the end point of 1971. So now let's look at the birth rate again of deer. So from the starting population of deer, let's just say this is a good year for the deer, a lot of food. They end up adding 920 babies. Well, so what? How many died that year? Because that's the number that has to go here for us to calculate the deer population change. So of those 920 born, how many died? How do we get that? We add 480 to 240. So you tell me what that number is, because that number, that means 480 plus 240, okay? We subtract that from 920 and we get a magic number here. That's your total change, which is going to be a positive. And then, so we take the 2,300, add that number to it, and you get your final deer population. So you're going to fill in the rest of this from the data in this table. Now, guys, at this point when you're counting the deer, ignore the wolf. Just know that you're going to be comparing the wolf population, whose population is dependent usually on how many deer they kill. Because the more they kill, the more food they have available to themselves and the more resources they have for making babies, believe it or not. And that's simply true for deer. So this is how you fill out the table. Remember, this number that you calculate has to be correct, because then that makes it to the next year. Think about this as an annual sampling. This is what you usually do for deer, is you look at annual sampling. It's not true for all creatures. Okay. So again, we're going to look at number of deer births, and you don't really care about that number so much because you're just going to subtract to that. Eventually, what are you going to subtract? The total number of deer that die, which that number goes there, and then you subtract this number from that. That goes there, and then you take the change and add it or subtract it to this number, which is, of course, whatever that number was, and you go down. So please practice this first, and try to be consistent when going through this. So keep this data table, because you will need it for later, and do include, type in your numbers on the data table, because I'll be grading you partially on that. So here is what your graphs are going to look like. You're going to see you could either put wolf or deer. What I would do if I was you is you will take these and actually write on them, and then take a picture of each and submit it with your written report. Unless you have an incredible ability to type this into the Word document, that is fine. You can actually use some of the images, use some of the aspects of Word to put in dots and whatever, and to draw a line across the graph. So what I want you to do is circle either wolf or deer, so I know what that is, and then fill in your axes. And your y-axis, which is here, okay, is going to be the population. That means the number of deer or wolf per each year. And where do we put the years? Down here. So you're going to have 1970, 71, and each one of these is going to be a year. Now the numbering is going to be a little tricky because you're going to have to look at your top number of organisms that you find in your data tables and set that as the next to the top of your axis here. So if you found, let's say, 2,400 deer, what I would do is try to get the 2,400 point to come out to around somewhere around here to here, so you can fill up the whole axis. With your wolf, don't use the same data points as the deer. If your wolf max out at 50, start your 50 point somewhere around here, and then add your other points down here. So if I do 50 here, that means 25 will be around here, and 0 will be around here. So try to use these boxes to the best that you can. But when you're graphing your data, what you're going to do is take, let's say, the total number of deer that you calculated at the end of a year, and put a dot next to that year point. And then go on and calculate your data. And then for this type of graph, you don't do a bar graph. You do a line graph, because sometimes your data might look like this, depending on the year and what's going on. And you're going to do that for the wolf and the deer separately. Okay, if you put it on one graph, it's going to look like a mess, because the wolves are going to look real tiny on one graph because their numbers only go up to, let's say, 50, and the deer go up to a couple of thousand to maybe 3,000. So draw these graphs separately and then compare the two, using different axes. But what you're looking for is what's called the curves of it, the ups and downs, or the smoothness of the changes in the population over time. So again, when you look at your axes, make sure that your axes are labeled Y and X. Do that first, so you remember to put the populations of the deer or the wolf here, and the year goes down here. And use appropriate distance axes. Like if you have a 10-year spread, spread out that 10-year. Don't put all 10 years in one area. Spread out that graph so it looks nice and smooth, or kind of nice and bubbly, and all your data is not like concentrated all here in one spot. And this is called perspective. But pay attention to your axes, because I'm going to be grading you on this. And plus, you're going to look at some videos on graphing. I expect you to watch the videos that go along with wolf predation and how wolf prey on deer and bison, because we're going to look at them too, but not graph them, just kind of say what we think their graphs will look like. And then you're going to look at 2 videos on graphing, because I think that's important to know how to do this, okay, and how to make graphs, because we'll be doing this later. So again, to end this, you're going to be mostly doing real data on wolf populations. And how do we calculate this? I said, we're not going to go out into the field and identify what caused a deer to die. And we're not going to go out and also trap wolves or photograph wolves and try to count their population. We're also going to hypothesize about what do you think a graph would look like, or how successful will wolves be on hunting bison. Will it look the same as deer being hunted by wolves, or bisons being hunted by wolves, which is a more difficult thing. So good luck.